History remembers empires by their victories, but sometimes it is the storms that write the final chapter. In the 13th century, the Mongol Empire stretched across continents, undefeated and unstoppable. Yet on the distant shores of Japan, a story unfolded that would defy the might of the world's greatest conquerors. It is a tale of samurai courage, of a nation's unyielding spirit, and of the mysterious winds that rose at the edge of history. This is the legend of the divine wind, Kamikaze. Imagine standing on the misty shore of a small island off the western edge of Japan. Dawn is just breaking. The salty wind sweeps through the pine forest along the coast. On the distant horizon, dark specks slowly emerge into a forest of towering masts. These are not merchant ships, but a fleet carrying war from the far northern steppe, the Mongol Empire. This story begins on the vast grasslands of Mongolia, where tribes once mired in endless conflict were bound together into a single force by one man, Genghis Khan. Under his iron hand, scattered clans were forged into a unified state in 1206. When he died in 1227, the empire did not falter but surged onward, a whirlwind that swept across half the known world. Among his successors, it was his grandson Kublai Khan who drove the empire's frontiers to their greatest height. From his throne in China, his gaze turned across the sea, and his ambitions fixed upon the islands of Japan. The strength of the Mongols lay not only in weapons but in speed. Born in the saddle, each warrior commanded several horses, switching mounts to cover more than 160 kilometers in a single day. A distant cloud of dust could, in moments, transform into a storm breaking over an enemy's head. The empire seemed invincible, yet even at its zenith, cracks were waiting to form. In the memory of the Mongols, one of their most bitter failures came from these small islands to the east. In rumor and in record, Japan was described as a land of gold. Marco Polo wrote of Zepangu, a place where the emperor's palace was roofed with pure gold, the floors covered with slabs 2 inches thick. For centuries, Chinese courts had received tribute of gold from Japanese envoys. That glittering image of a golden kingdom made Japan a dazzling prize in the eyes of Kublai Khan. In truth, the islands were richer in silver than in gold, yet the myth alone was reason enough to justify a conquest. In 1266, Kublai sent a letter proposing friendly relations, but in it, he addressed the Emperor of Japan merely as king, a deliberate insult implying subordination and threatening war. For the Japanese, this was an outrage. The first envoys returned empty-handed. Subsequent missions in 1268, 1269, 1271, and 1272 were denied landing altogether. At that time, real power in Japan rested not with the emperor in Kyoto, who remained a symbolic figure, but with the Kamakura shogunate under the Hojo clan. It was the shoguns who would hold the nation's fate as the storm from the north gathered strength. On the battlefield, the contrast was stark. Samurai wore the heavy yet intricate o-yoroi armor, rode small horses, and upheld ancient ritual. The first arrow was loosed as a declaration of honor, meant for a worthy opponent. The Mongol cavalry, by contrast, fought in unison. Volleys of arrows, ranks advancing and retreating in rhythm. They carried with them a terrifying innovation never before heard on Japanese shores. Thunder bombs of paper and iron, packed with gunpowder and hurled from catapults. Their explosions echoed like thunder, marking the first time Kyushu heard the roar of firearms. Samurai armor was fashioned from lacquered scales of iron and leather, bound with silk cords, strong yet flexible. Wide shoulder plates, bamboo throat guards, helmets of riveted steel, sometimes with fearsome masks. Archers often bared their arms for speed. Their supreme weapon was the curved katana, sharp enough to slice through brigandine armor. The long yumi bow, built of laminated wood and bamboo lacquered against the rain, towered above its wielder and could deliver piercing shots even from horseback. The Mongol horsemen wore leather coats, swords and daggers at their belts, felt boots on their feet. Heavy cavalry donned lamellar armor of iron and hide, with barding for their horses. Their composite bows, short, powerful, made of horn, sinew, and bamboo, could send arrows flying with deadly force. Each warrior carried quivers filled with shafts, some tipped with poison. Round wooden shields, curved sabers, and a discipline of maneuver made them a fearsome force. While Kublai Khan gazed across the sea, his armies already dominated the mainland. After years of campaigning, the southern Song dynasty had been pushed southward, a sign of the Mongols' shift from nomadic warriors to rulers of a settled empire. Earlier still, since 1231, they had battered Korea into submission, and by 1259 the peninsula was firmly under Mongol control. With Korea in hand, the empire possessed a strategic springboard aimed directly at Japan. In Kamakura, Hojo Tokumun, the 6th regent of the Hojo clan, did not ride into battle himself, yet his orders would decide the fate of tens of thousands. It was a clash of two philosophies: the samurai, who prized individual honor and began battle with a single arrow of challenge, and the Mongols, who valued collective discipline, unleashing volleys in synchronized rhythm. Along the shores of Kyushu, the air was as taut as a drawn bow. Villages lay silent, broken only by the rasp of whetstones on blades, the clang of hammers on armor, the murmur of prayers rising into the night. Out at sea, the silhouettes of Mongol sails swelled larger each day. The legend of a land of gold had sparked one of the most brutal expeditions of the Middle Ages. But what awaited the invaders was not treasure, but narrow beaches, low walls, jagged reefs, and a people long accustomed to storms. In Kublai Khan's grand encampment, maps stretched from Korea down to Tsushima, across Iki, and into Hakata Bay. His fleet numbered in the hundreds, bearing tens of thousands of soldiers. The plan was a lightning strike to sow terror and force Japan into submission. Yet the Japanese did not tremble. They turned fear into anger and anger into resolve. Soon Tsushima and Iki, two small islands at the gates of Japan, would become blood-soaked outposts. On Tsushima, Deputy Governor So Sukakuni commanded barely 80 samurai and retainers. He knew his force was dwarfed by the sea of men before him, but retreat was never an option. Under cover of darkness, Sukakuni led his warriors across the hills to Komoda Beach, where the Mongol fleet was expected to land. The Japanese placed their faith in omens. Days earlier, the shrine of Hachiman, god of war, had erupted in flames. Many feared it a curse, but when the fire died down, a flock of white doves descended upon the charred roof. To the samurai, it was a sign. Hachiman had not abandoned them. At dawn on November 4th, 1274, the sea lay calm as the Mongol fleet lowered its sails. Row after row of warships pressed against the shore. By 4 o'clock, battle erupted in fury. So Sukakuni held to tradition, ordering an opening volley. But this time it was not a single arrow of honor. It was a storm of shafts ripping through the darkness, cutting down invaders as they stepped onto the sand. Moments later, thousands of Mongol arrows answered like a tempest, striking deep into the sand and trees. On Komoda Beach, the samurai of Tsushima fought as though each man were an army unto himself. Chronicles speak of Saito Sukesada, a trusted retainer of Sukakuni, who struck down a Mongol officer trapped in the coastal forest. Moments later, Sukesada was pierced by 3 arrows through the chest, yet he stood and fought until he finally collapsed. His story became legend. It was the opening act of one of the fiercest conflicts of the Middle Ages, a clash where the honor of the samurai faced the storm of the steppe. The valor of Tsushima turned the battle into a hymn of resistance. Yet courage could not erase the vast gulf in numbers and weapons. The Mongols, tens of thousands strong, drilled in unbreakable discipline, advanced to the beat of war drums and unleashed gunpowder bombs of paper and iron. The explosion shook the shore, stunning the defenders. Still, So Sukakuni and his men did not yield. They fought until the last. When their number dwindled to a quarter, then a tenth, they still charged. At last, Sukekuni and his 80 warriors fell on the blood-soaked sand. Tsushima was lost in a single day. The Mongols burned villages, slaughtered civilians, leveled everything in their path. Yet the spirit of Sukekuni and his companions lived on for centuries, proof that honor can outlast life itself. After 9 days of slaughter, the Mongol fleet turned south toward Iki Island. Defending it was Taira no Kagetaka, a descendant of the Taira clan once defeated in the Heiji Rebellion. Having heard the grim news from Tsushima, he prepared in advance, dispatching messengers to Dazaifu in Kyushu and reinforcing the island's defenses. On November 13th, the Mongol sails appeared once again. Unlike Sukekuni, Kagetaka commanded more men, yet still far too few against an enemy numbering in the tens of thousands. He chose to meet them on the beach. At first, his samurai fought ferociously, forcing the invaders back to their ships as night fell. That evening, he withdrew his battered forces to his castle, hoping to hold until reinforcements arrived. By dawn, the Mongols had surrounded the stronghold. They dragged hundreds of villagers bound in ropes, using them as human shields. Faced with the impossible, Kagetaka chose death with honor. With his family and retainers, he performed seppuku. His remaining warriors hurled themselves into a final, hopeless charge. Only one survived, Kagetaka's daughter, sent away beforehand to plead for aid. Iki fell, its fields soaked in blood no less than Tsushima's. Villages burned, civilians were massacred. The news from Tsushima and Iki raced across Kyushu. In Dazaifu, the authorities knew the enemy's next target would be Hakata Bay, broad, open, and the most vulnerable landing ground. The Japanese mobilized forces from 9 surrounding provinces. Samurai, mounted warriors, and peasant levies converged in haste, the air thick with urgency and dread. Commanding the defense was Shoni Kagesuke, scion of a clan long entrusted with guarding Kyushu. He and his men established their camp near the shrine of Hachiman, turning the sacred ground into the heart of resistance. To them, Hakata was the final gate. If it fell, the Mongols would sweep into the plains and march straight to Dazaifu. On November 17th, the Mongol fleet entered Hakata Bay. War drums thundered as rows of ships pressed toward the shore. The invaders deployed in dense formations, shields locked into walls, their advance paced by the beat of drums. The fiercest clash of that winter had begun. The Japanese held to tradition. A samurai loosed the first arrow, a challenge of honor. But the Mongols only scoffed. To them, it was an empty gesture. At once, volleys of arrows and gunpowder bombs of paper and iron rained down on the defenders. The contrast was stark. Samurai fought as individuals seeking glory, while the Mongols moved as a single body, advancing and retreating in unison to the rhythm of their drums. Explosions tore across the shoreline, smoke and fire shrouding the field. The Japanese, overwhelmed, fell back to Mizuki, the last fortress shielding Dazaifu. Yet their resistance was fierce. Chronicles record that Shoni Kagesuke shot down a Mongol officer, throwing the ranks into confusion. Some sources even claim the invaders lost up to a third of their force in the battle. As night fell and the struggle dragged on, a sudden winter storm swept in. The air turned bitter, black clouds rolled from the sea, and the east wind roared. Waves battered the Mongol ships, packed too tightly in the bay. Many crashed against one another and splintered. Others were hurled onto the reefs. Built hastily in Korea and southern China, their thin hulls could not withstand the fury of the storm. Japanese chronicles describe countless bodies washing ashore on Kyushu the next morning. Korean annals speak of a fleet heavily damaged by the gale. Hundreds of ships were sunk or wrecked. Already bloodied in battle, the invaders were broken by nature, their morale collapsing. Facing the annihilation of their force, the Mongol commanders gave the order to retreat to Korea. The first invasion of Japan ended in bitter failure. No foothold won, tens of thousands of men and ships lost. leaving behind only the grim memory of the winds of Hakata. Even after retreating, Kublai Khan had not given up. The following year, he sent envoys once more to Japan. This time, the Japanese showed no restraint. All the envoys were executed, a clear message that they would never submit. At that moment, the Mongol Empire was consumed by its war against the Southern Song, and so the invasion of Japan was put on hold. 7 quiet years passed, yet to the Japanese it was not peace, but the silence before a greater storm. They knew Kublai would return. As early as 1276, the Kamakura shogunate issued orders to fortify the coast. A stone wall nearly 20 kilometers long was raised along Hakata Bay, 2 meters high, enough to halt enemy cavalry from charging inland. Built some 50 meters back from the shoreline, it created a killing ground where defenders could rain arrows upon any landing force. Stones were laid firm, earth packed tight, transforming Hakata Bay into a natural fortress stretching from east to west. The wall became a symbol of resolve, a small nation that would not bow, pouring its strength into a colossal defense for the battles to come. Along the coast, villagers labored in shifts, digging earth, hauling stones, stacking ramparts. Farmers left their plows to carry rock. Samurai set aside their swords to work as masons. Even women and children joined in, for all understood that if the coast fell, nowhere would be safe. It was not only material defenses they prepared, but also their spirit. Shrines were repaired, rituals held often. Priests of Buddhism and Shinto prayed to Hachiman, Amaterasu, and countless kami, beseeching them to spread their arms in protection when the storm returned. Across the sea, Kublai Khan had never abandoned his ambition. After crushing the Southern Song in 1279, the Yuan Empire was free to look east once more. His orders were clear: hundreds of warships to be built, troops levied from both Korea and southern China. Unlike the expedition of 1274, little more than a test, this time the plan was unmistakable: conquest, occupation, and the transformation of Japan into a Mongol colony. Today, archaeologists have uncovered the wrecks of Mongol ships buried beneath the sea, some carrying farming tools. Clear evidence that the Yuan invaders brought not only soldiers, but also peasants intending to settle. This was no mere raid, it was a plan to take root. In 1280, Kublai Khan convened a grand military council, summoning his top commanders. The decision was made. The invasion would strike with 2 great arms. The Eastern Route Army would sail from Korea as before. The Southern Route Army, far larger, would depart from southern China. The 2 fleets would rendezvous near Iki before striking Kyushu together. But the very scale of the plan concealed its weakness. Among the tens of thousands pressed into service, not all were elite. Convicts were promised pardons, peasants were conscripted, and mercenaries were drawn from many regions. Korea bore the heaviest burden, compelled to build 900 warships, while China supplied roughly 600. The strain left the Korean populace exhausted and resentful, though none dared resist. Even so, the force was immense. More than 140,000 men, nearly 3 times the army of 1274. For Japan, the numbers were a nightmare. Yet in the 7 years since the first invasion, they had not only built walls but forged warriors. Samurai were mustered from every province, regardless of class. They drilled with bow and sword, practiced loosing arrows from ramparts, trained to repel cavalry, and honed tactics of guerrilla warfare at sea in small boats. The skills of fishing became the skills of war. Light wooden vessels, quick and maneuverable, were turned into weapons, slipping close to strike the great Mongol ships. Across the nation, the air was drawn tight as a bowstring. Legends tell of Hakata's shore blazing with torchlight every night, hammers and chisels clanging, stones pounding into walls year after year. Along the new ramparts of Hakata Bay, samurai stood watch in lacquered armor, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. To them, the coming battle was not only to defend their land, but to guard their honor. Those who lived would carve their names into history, Those who fell would scatter like cherry blossoms at their season's end. In 1281, the order to march was given. Two vast Mongol armadas began to move. From Korea, the Eastern Route Army set sail on May 22nd. From southern China, the Southern Route Army followed soon after. The plan: rendezvous near Iki, then strike Kyushu together. The Japanese were ready. They knew Hakata remained the most likely landing ground. Along the 20-kilometer stone wall, archers lay in wait, storehouses filled with arrows. Offshore, small boats hid in the coves, prepared to dart out. On June 9, 1281, the Eastern Route Army reached Tsushima. So Morikuni, son of So Sukakuni, who had fallen 7 years before, led about 300 men to meet them. They knew there was no escape, yet still charged to block the enemy. Once more, a handful of samurai faced a sea of invaders. Morikuni and his warriors were cut down, civilians slaughtered without mercy. On June 14th, the fleet descended upon Iki. The local Shoni clan, led by Shoni Sukatoki and his kin, met them on the western shore. The clash was fierce but hopelessly outmatched. They were crushed. Iki fell, its fields drenched in blood. This time the Yuan did not simply plunder. They turned the island into a forward base for their assault on Kyushu. According to the plan, the Eastern Route Army was to await the Southern Route Army before advancing. But for reasons unclear, perhaps intelligence from Chinese spies about the Hakata Wall, they split their force. One detachment pressed toward Hakata, while another veered north toward Nagato and Honshu. On June 25th, the Mongol fleet approached Hakata, but the sight before them was not what it had been 7 years earlier. Where once there had been open sand, now stood a solid wall of stone, stretching for miles, bristling with archers. Each time the enemy ships tried to close in, volleys rained down from above. The barrier shielded the defenders, leaving the Mongols struggling to return fire. Their massive warships could only linger helplessly offshore, staring at a coastline sealed in stone. The Japanese did not wait for the enemy to land. They struck first, sending out small boats packed with a handful of samurai. Slipping through the waves, they swarmed the great Mongol ships. Warriors clambered up on ropes, some even plunging into the sea to swim across and strike with their blades. Many returned with severed heads as proof of their kills. Night raids proved especially deadly. The small craft moved like phantoms, closing silently before erupting in blood and fire. This guerrilla warfare at sea inflicted heavy losses, forcing the Mongols to retreat and seize the islands of Shiga and Noko as bases. But the Japanese pressed the fight further. Crossing the narrow sandbar to Shiga, they stormed Mongol encampments, spreading chaos. Continuous raids turned the waters of Hakata into a nightmare. By July, the Southern Route Army from China finally arrived, bringing with it overwhelming numbers. The two armadas joined forces and made a fateful decision. Rather than assault Hakata, blocked by the impregnable wall, they turned toward Takashima, a larger island about 50 kilometers west. Their plan: establish a permanent base there and then drive into Kyushu. Summer in these seas was the season of storms. In the midst of battle, a typhoon began to form. At first, it was only strong winds, sails straining against control. But within hours, the gale became fury. Thunder split the sky, rain fell in torrents, waves rose like mountains. The Mongol ships, most built in haste, could not withstand the force. Many smashed against one another and splintered. Others were torn from their anchors and dashed to pieces upon the rocks. Those who survived the waves washed ashore, only to be hunted down. Samurai scoured the beaches, cutting down Mongol soldiers without mercy. Only a few among the conscripted song troops were spared, yet even they were condemned to lives of slavery. On the beaches of Hakata and Takashima, the wrecks remained. More than 7 centuries later, archaeologists would recover timbers, armor, weapons, even farming tools. Silent relics of a storm that altered the course of history. The evidence of these ships and the agricultural tools buried with them revealed the truth. The 1281 expedition had not been intended as a mere raid, but as a plan of permanent occupation. History did not allow it. The divine wind had risen, and together with the will of the samurai, it carved Japan's name into the rare company of nations that escaped the grasp of the Mongol Empire. The disastrous news struck Kublai Khan's court in Dadu like a blade. Chronicles say he raged, vowing to punish his commanders and even contemplating a third invasion. But in truth, the Mongol Empire was already exhausted. To the west, they faced the Mamluks and uprisings across Central Asia. To the south, the newly conquered lands of the Song were still unstable. The empire's economy and supply lines were drained to the breaking point. Most of all, the soldiers' faith was shattered. After 2 failed crossings, few believed Japan could ever be taken. Storms, treacherous coasts, and the ferocity of Japan's defenders had buried Kublai's ambitions in the east. The power of belief was plain to see. The samurai who fought at Hakata and Tsushima were celebrated as heroes, rewarded with land and titles, their names carved into history. Their descendants bore pride in the bloodline of those who had turned back the storm from the steppe. Even commoners, those who built the walls and lost loved ones, became part of the legend. The wall of Hakata still stands, weathered by centuries, a monument to resolve. It recalls a time when the nation faced the mightiest empire on earth and held firm. Across Kyushu, shrines to Hachiman rose, becoming places of pilgrimage. People believed the god of war himself had called forth wind and storm to protect his children. For the rest of the world, the failure in Japan was one of the rare moments when the Mongol Empire could not conquer. It proved that no matter how powerful, there are limits. Geography, climate, and the spirit of a people can form an unbreakable wall. For Korea, the invasions left scars. Forced to build hundreds of ships and send tens of thousands of men, the populace was drained and embittered. For the Chinese of the fallen Song, conscripted into Mongol ranks, the fate was tragic. Drowned at sea, cut down in battle, or enslaved. These wars were not only Japan's memory, but the shared suffering of many peoples caught in the wake of Kublai Khan's ambition. But why did the Mongols never launch a third invasion of Japan? The reason was not only the divine winds or the strain of logistics. To the south, another adversary blocked Kublai Khan's ambitions, Dai Viet. Immediately after the disaster at Tsushima in 1281, the Yuan dynasty turned its might toward Southeast Asia. In Dai Viet, under the Tron dynasty, they met a wall of fire against the horsemen of the steppe. In 1285, a massive army led by Prince Togon invaded, only to be driven back in chaos by Tron Hungdao. 3 years later, in 1288, the Mongol fleet was annihilated once more on the Bakdang River. These repeated defeats drained manpower and shattered the aura of Mongol invincibility. From that point, Japan became for Kublai Khan nothing more than a distant dream, a prize the Yuan would never again have the strength to seize. It can be said that 2 nations on opposite ends of East Asia together closed the door on Mongol expansion into the seas. One was Japan, shielded by the divine wind. The other was Dai Viet, defended by strategy and steel on the waters of Bakdang. And across those distant shores, history echoes the same message. Even the greatest empire has its limits when faced with nature and the will of a people. The legacy of the divine wind did not end in the Middle Ages. More than 6 centuries later, during World War II, as Japan faced the threat of direct assault by the Allied forces, the word kamikaze was invoked once more. But this time it was no longer the storms of nature, but the sacrifice of men. The Japanese government formed special air units known as Kamikaze Tokubetsu Kogekitai, the Divine Wind Special Attack Units. Thousands of young pilots volunteered to fly planes packed with explosives and crash them into enemy warships, most famously during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines in 1944 and at Okinawa in 1945. Though the contexts were different, the belief was the same. When the nation was in peril, a sacred force, whether drawn from nature or from human beings, transformed into the storm itself, would rise to defend the homeland. Thus, kamikaze became a symbol woven across Japanese history, from the divine winds that shattered the Mongol fleets in the 13th century to the resolve of the pilots of World War II, all embodying the unyielding spirit of a small nation facing the world's greatest empires. The two failed invasions had become a turning point. Had the Mongols succeeded, East Asian history would have taken another path. Japan might have been reduced to a vassal, the samurai culture extinguished, and the myth of a divine nation never born. Instead, the Mongol defeat strengthened Japan's sense of identity, elevated the prestige of the Kamakura shogunate, and nurtured the spirit of Bushido for centuries to come.